Life in Europe in 1919 differed in significant ways from what it had been like before the war. The imperial governments of Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey were gone. New countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had re-emerged. Russia had overthrown the Tsar, or its emperor, and was in the middle of a civil war, which the communists would eventually win in 1921. The first years after the war were not easy. The people of Central Europe suffered from famine caused by wartime blockades of food. Returning soldiers faced unemployment. A deadly flu epidemic in 1919 killed as many people as had died in the war. Farms and cities and railroad lines had been torn up from the fighting. Europeans spent the next 5 years rebuilding and recovering. Germans had to make huge reparation payments for the war to France and Britain, further slowing down German economic recovery. The United States had emerged from the war as a great economic superpower. During the war, Britain and France had purchased American war goods on credit, so now after the war, Britain and France had to repay that debt to the United States. Americans faced a brief recession when the war ended, but American consumers soon began buying mass-produced goods made in U.S. factories. The 1920s in the United States was a time of great economic growth, a huge increase in consumer goods, and really changed the way life was lived. This kind of good economic growth eventually spread throughout the world. But in 1929, the bubble burst. The stock market crashed in New York City, starting a chain reaction that plunged the American economy into the Great Depression. The time after the war in the 1930s is also known for the rise of fascism. Fascism is taken from the political party formed by Benito Mussolini in Italy, but historians have found similar governments in Germany. There are 5 key characteristics of a fascist government. 1, there's nationalism. Fascists have extreme nationalism, believing that the highest value was the nation. They took their belief to extremes, often claiming that other nations were not as superior as they were. Fascists also react really terribly against liberalism. Fascists oppose liberal ideas like democracy, socialism, labor unions, and striking. They're also very strong anti-communists. Fascists believe in the unity of all social classes. They felt like a single national party should unite all social classes. They also believed that the strong had a natural right to dominate the weak. Fascists believed that a single, all-powerful leader like Mussolini or Hitler could best represent the national will and lead the nation. Fascists also believed in strong militarism and that violence would defeat their political opponents and prepared for the use of war to expand their nations. Fascists saw war as a glorious experience that would only benefit their nation. Several earlier currents of European thought, like anti-Semitism, racism, and social Darwinism, had helped prepare the way for the rise of fascism. Anti-Semitism was already an established trend in European culture. Jews faced prejudice and persecution because their beliefs and customs made them easy targets of social unrest and economic difficulty. This was especially true in the late 1800s, where Jews were blamed for the disruption caused by the rapid industrialization of Europe, which isn't really fair, but racism usually isn't. So racism is a contempt for other races. This too was an established trend in Europe. European racism was strengthened by the experiences of overseas imperialism and the spirit of nationalism. Think white man's burden, that somehow Europeans have to rise up, help African and Asians rise up to meet some kind of moral standard, but they're never going to truly be equal with Europeans, allegedly, because racism. Social Darwinism made racism and anti-Semitism respectable by applying Charles Darwin's theories of evolution to human society. Social Darwinists believed that all human groups competed for survival and that stronger groups had the right to succeed over weaker groups, which deserved to die out, which isn't exactly what Darwin was talking about, but they twisted his ideas, sprinkled in some racism and anti-Semitism, and created a social movement from it. So Europe was shaken to its core by World War I. Immense political changes had taken place. New countries had been created and old ruling families had lost their power. Often, the people who were running the government in the new European democracies were unaccustomed to having political power. In Germany, the Kaiser was forced out when they lost World War I. The new democratic republic, known as the Weimar Republic, was weak. Many landowning industrialists, military leaders, and professionals opposed the republic. They preferred to give all political power to a single leader rather than entrust it to the common people. In areas that had never known democracy before, it took some time for democracy to take hold, and in Germany, people weren't very supportive of it. The Russian Bolsheviks demonstrated how to organize a mass political party and how to build a totalitarian state. At the same time, the middle classes in other European countries feared the spread of communism. Communism requires people to give up their ownership of their land, of their homes, of their free will to do the jobs they want to do. This fear of communists led a lot of people to support people like Mussolini and Hitler because they were strongly anti-communist. A mood of dissatisfaction existed in Italy after the war. In 1922, Benito Mussolini seized power and began to make Italy into a fascist state. He copied many Bolshevik practices while denouncing their ideas. Like the Bolsheviks, Mussolini's party had its own newspaper, as well as a private army just of party members. Mussolini used violence against his opponents, unions were abolished, and strikes were outlawed, and the press was censored. Within 3 years, Italy had become completely fascist and even had a secret police, much like the Russians did. The leaders of the Weimar Republic were blamed for signing the Treaty of Versailles, which essentially humiliated Germany on the world stage, by forcing them to pay crippling reparations to Britain and France, and forcing them to say that the entirety of World War I was entirely Germans' fault. These reparations had also led to soaring German inflation in 1923. By the late 1920s, the Weimar Republic had achieved some stability. The calm ended when the Great Depression spread from the US to Germany in 1930. 6 million people lost their jobs, more than a third of the workforce. Government leaders could not agree on how to cope with this catastrophe of unemployment. In the elections, the farmers, the unemployed, and the middle class turned to the radical solutions offered by the Nazi Party. Adolf Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party, or the Nationalist Socialist Party. An electrifying speaker, Hitler recorded his main ideas in his book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. His vision for Germany was this. 1, he condemned the Weimar Republic. Hitler blamed Germany's humiliation at Versailles on Weimar leaders. He urged Germany to abandon democracy and return Germany to the glory of a strong leader. 2, Hitler promoted the idea of the Aryan race. He believed that Germans were superior and Aryan, who should rule the world. He planned to wipe out all Slavic peoples to make what's called Lebensraum, or living space, for German settlers in Eastern Europe. 3, anti-Semitism. Hitler called the Jews an evil race that should be destroyed for causing Germany's defeat in the war. He saw communism as a Jewish plot to control the world. The Nazis formed their own private army called the Brown Shirts. These are former soldiers and unemployed workers, mostly. They beat up political opponents, they beat up Jewish people, and they staged really impressive rallies. When the Great Depression hit Germany, support for the Nazis grew. Hitler was appointed chief minister in 1933, and he quickly secured complete control by burning down the German legislative building called the Reichstag. But he blamed the fire on communists and used the incident to obtain emergency powers, becoming an absolute dictator. The Nazi Party, like the fascists in Italy, took over every aspect of German social, economic, and political life. In Hitler's Third Reich, he made a lot of sweeping changes. And what we say by Third Reich, so initially, we have the Kaiser, he ruled over Germany. Then you have the Weimar Republic, that's 2. And then you have Hitler, he's the Third Reich, so the third reign of Germany. This is what life was like under Hitler's Nazi Germany. Number 1, human rights were suppressed. People were arrested and executed without trials. Rival political parties, unions, and independent newspapers were closed, and they were replaced by pro-Nazi ones. School children were taught Nazi ideas. Newspapers, radios, films blared out Nazi propaganda, and no other sources of information or organizations were permitted. German Jews also lost their citizenship. They were thrown out of government jobs and had to wear yellow stars on their clothes, symbolizing the Star of David, a Jewish symbol. Jewish shops were vandalized and synagogues were burned. Hitler made use of public works projects such as building highways and military rearmament to achieve employment. So out of work people went to work building highways, building other buildings and bridges, and working in factories to rearm Germany. Economic prosperity then returned to Germany. The Nazis also used the threat of violence and control. The Gestapo, which was the German secret police, arrested suspected opponents who were thrown into concentration camps where they were eventually tortured or killed.